Once we had been flying for a couple of hours. I realized that the man sitting 5 rows in front of me was looking at me. I admit that it might have been paranoia because I was exhausted, and flying makes me anxious, and the prospect of sitting in coach for 10 hours fidgety and restless, desperate for something I could fixate on. But the man sitting 5 seats down the aisle was making me nervous, and I couldn't brush that feeling aside. I don't know, I just had a bad feeling the moment I saw him. He had already been seated when I came into the plane, dragging my carry-on behind me as per usual. God, I fucking detest airplanes. I was stuck in the narrow corridor waiting for the guy in front of me to stop struggling with his oversized luggage inside the overhead compartment, his wife cursing angrily at him in quick Spanish. I looked away, trying to keep my irritation under control. This was going to be a long flight, but it would feel longer if I couldn't keep calm. That was when I met the man's eyes. I couldn't begin to describe them. He had one of those normal faces, nothing remarkable or memorable about it. Plain brown hair, plain brown eyes, not too thin, not too fat. I don't even think I could easily pick him out of a lineup. I couldn't even tell if he looked sad or happy, just very plain. Despite myself, I just smiled a little bit. We are all travelers in pain, aren't we? He didn't smile back. The guy in front of me cursed again and started trying to shove his carry-on luggage under the seat in front of him. I watched him for a while, and when I looked around again, the unremarkable man was looking at me. Same blank expression as before, except for the smallest wrinkle in between his brows. The only indication of any kind of thought of feeling. It was impossible to read his face, but I couldn't help but think that I had piqued his interest. It was a relief when I was finally allowed to move along, leaving the man behind. I found my seat, stored my bag above my head and my purse under the seat before me, then put on my headphones and tried not to think too much about how I couldn't stop a plane from crashing, or how much I hated when things were out of my control. Having the aisle seat, I could see the man, his fingers drumming the armrest as people poured into the plane, in between bodies and luggage. I think I caught a glimpse of him turning his face around, trying to get a glimpse of me, but he didn't do it again once the plane took off. I guess it's difficult to be a creep when you're trapped in a flying metal box. I did see him glance my way once, but after that, he started fumbling with his phone, so he might be distracted. I couldn't tell where he was from. That was a direct flight from Toronto to São Paulo, so most of the passengers were Brazilian tourists or immigrants, such as myself, going back to visit their friends and family. The guy didn't look like anything, so he could be Brazilian, I suppose, or Canadian. There are some pretty weird types in Toronto. Maybe, I told myself as I watched him fumble with the phone, maybe he is just a nervous passenger, like myself, someone who hates flying just as much as I do and is just heading to a Brazilian beach to escape a harsh Canadian winter. And that was when I realized his phone was off. He'd had it out for at least an hour, tilting the screen one way or another, but the screen was pitch black. He didn't have headphones or AirPods on, and he surely wasn't playing a game. He wasn't even watching a movie. For the last hour, he had been using his phone as a mirror to look at me. Somehow, I was his in-flight entertainment. Don't look worried, I told myself. Looking worried would make me look weak, and I didn't want him to think of me as an easy target. I sat there for a moment, my heartbeat picking up pace as I considered my options. Most people will tell you to call attention to a creep that is making you uncomfortable. And I would usually agree, but this wasn't some gross drunk asshole on the subway trying to put a hand under my skirt. I wasn't entirely sure the guy was doing anything, and the last thing I wanted was to be the hysterical woman making a scene. Discreetly, I grabbed my purse and walked towards the washroom in the back of the plane, but I didn't go. Instead, I looked in the galley for a flight attendant. "Is there a way to change seats?" I asked him. He looked mildly annoyed because this was a busy flight, and there weren't many unoccupied seats. Once I explained the reason, though, his eyebrows shot up. "The guy on 26H?" I was a little relieved. If he had noticed, then maybe I wasn't being as paranoid as I thought. "Yeah, that one." He looked in that direction, mild annoyance turning into impatience. Then he said, "I think there's an empty seat in the back of the plane." I thanked him and took my seat in the last row. The turbulence was going to make me nauseous, but at least I would feel safer with some distance between me and that creep. I settled in, had my shitty airplane dinner, listened to a few episodes of a funny podcast on my phone, and slowly felt myself relax. I even managed to fall asleep. Sometime later, I cracked my eyes open again and... shit, fuck! My heart felt as it was going to leap out of my mouth. He was staring at me again, except this time, he wasn't even trying to be discreet. He was just standing there, on the other side of the aisle, looking at me over the sleeping heads of the other passengers. Maybe it would have been wiser to pretend that I was asleep, but I didn't want him to think he could intimidate me, so I loudly asked, "Do you need something?" with enough volume and indignation that I attracted the attention of a couple of passengers. I saw the sympathetic flight attendant walk towards him. The man didn't even flinch. His eyes still on mine. He smiled. It was the first hint of any emotion that I had seen on his face, and I didn't like it. He looked smug, as if he knew a secret that I hadn't figured out yet. Before the flight attendant could say anything, the man turned and walked away. The flight attendant was kind enough to ask if I wanted to move again, but I didn't think it would make much of a difference. One of the perks of flying is that there is nowhere to run, but there was also nothing the man could do to me. It was another 4 hours before we landed, and until then, the man didn't bother me, nor did I leave my seat. I wasn't about to risk it. Once we landed, I waited for everyone else to leave the plane so that I could keep an eye out for him. From the back of the plane, I managed to catch a glimpse of his orange shirt as he left, but he didn't look back once. Once I knew that he was gone and the aisles were finally clear of other passengers, I thanked the flight attendant and went back to my original seat to fetch my carry-on luggage. I wasn't in a hurry to catch my connection, which would depart in 3 hours, but the Guarulhos International Airport is one of the least reliable airports I have ever seen. Once I got my luggage, I would have to go through customs, then check my luggage again, then rush to the other side of the airport to catch a domestic flight, all of which should take me at least 1 hour, if not more, depending on how many people were flying. I was worried about all of that, but all of those worries faded away because I realized something while taking my carry-on from the overhead compartment. The tag was missing. The tag with my full name, phone number, and address. Everything that a person would need if they wanted to find me. That was 3 weeks ago, and I'm about to get on the flight back to Toronto. But I don't know what I'm going to do once I get there. I'm scared of going home. In January, I went to Washington, D.C. with some very close family friends. Coming from a town of about 11,000 people and never having been to a city even close to D.C. size, I was scared out of my mind that I might get pickpocketed or mugged or something. TV has led me to believe that big cities like this had absolutely packed streets that were difficult to even walk on, resulting in regular occurrences such as these. Needless to say, I was relieved when the trip ended without any such incident. At the DC airport, our 6 a.m. flight was delayed 3 or 4 times due to weather. By the time we finally got to the Denver, Colorado airport, it was around midnight, preventing us from driving the rest of the way home that night, as we had originally planned. I refused to pee on airplanes unless absolutely necessary, so when we landed, I had to go. So I, along with my friend's mom, who also had to go, went to the restroom. When I came out of the stall, I noticed a security lady was now standing beside the door. I had heard no other footsteps come in the completely empty restroom. My ears were actually quite alert because the empty airport freaked me out. So this confused me a bit, but I just smiled at her and washed my hands. Approximately 10 seconds later, a toilet flushed. Instead of my friend's mom, a creepy-looking man with a black sweatshirt on, hood up, emerged from the stall. At the sight of the airport employee, he lowered his head and quickly walked out of the restroom. She followed him out, saying, "This is clearly marked as a women's restroom." At that time, probably mostly due to sleep deprivation. I didn't think much of it, but the next day it really dawned on me. A man wearing a black sweatshirt with a hood up in a women's restroom, which was marked as such with quite an enormous sign. It's midnight and the airport is practically deserted. Plus, he entered the restroom without a single sound, which for me was the worst part. I don't recall hearing any footsteps or extra sounds of urination or anything like that, so I honestly don't think he even used the restroom at all. Rather, just pretended by flushing the toilet. I repeatedly mentally thanked that security guard for seeing this. I very well could have been kidnapped, murdered, raped, who knows? He easily could have jumped me. I hadn't even looked up until the security guard spoke to him. But the second I did, I got a very creepy vibe from him, and he didn't even really look at me. I never told any of my friends' family, but my mom may have. So that's probably the most frightening thing that's ever happened to my young self.